Within minutes of 10:22, on the morning of the 4th of June, 1942, 3 Japanese aircraft carriers were burning in the Pacific. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the core of the force that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, had been hit within minutes. Bombs tore through flight decks. Fires rolled into hangars crowded with aircraft, munitions, and aviation fuel. Deck crews who had spent the morning launching attacks now fought smoke, exploding gasoline, and steel too hot to touch. By the next day, a 4th carrier, Soryu, was dying too. Japan had come to Midway with the stronger fleet, the more experienced naval aviators, and a plan designed to lure America's remaining carriers into annihilation. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto believed Midway would be the bait. Japanese aircraft would smash the island. American commanders at Pearl Harbor would panic. Their carriers would race west to save it. Then submarines, scout planes, battleships, and Nagumo's carrier force would close around them. On paper, the trap looked overwhelming. But when Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo launched his first strike against Midway before dawn, the American carriers were not leaving Pearl Harbor. Enterprise, Hornet, and the damaged Yorktown were already waiting northeast of the island, hidden beyond the horizon near a point on the chart called Point Luck. Admiral Chester Nimitz had moved them there because of fragments of a broken code, a false radio message about a water shortage, and one terrifying gamble, that his intelligence officers had identified the Japanese target correctly, if they were wrong. Nimitz had placed nearly every operational American carrier in the Central Pacific where Yamamoto could destroy them. Japan thought it was setting the ambush. It never realized the prey had arrived first. To understand how that reversal became possible, rewind 6 months. On the 7th of December, 1941, Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor and left battleships burning along Battleship Row. In the months that followed, Japanese forces swept across the Pacific with a speed that made resistance look temporary. Hong Kong fell. Singapore surrendered. The Philippines were collapsing. The Dutch East Indies were seized. Carrier aircraft struck from Ceylon to the Coral Sea. The weapon behind that expansion was not simply the Japanese Navy. It was the first air fleet, often called the Kido Butai, a concentrated carrier striking force whose pilots, deck crews, and commanders had trained to launch massed attacks with a precision no other navy had yet matched. 4 of its carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Soryu, would sail toward Midway with roughly 229 aircraft embarked. Yamamoto understood one danger. American factories could replace ships and aircraft faster than Japan could. A long war would slowly turn industrial capacity into a weapon Japan could not defeat. He needed one decisive battle before that happened. Midway appeared to offer it. The small atoll sat more than 1,000 miles northwest of Oahu, close enough to threaten Hawaii and important enough that the United States could not ignore its capture. Yamamoto's staff built an enormous operation around that assumption, spreading ships across thousands of miles of ocean to seize the island and destroy the fleet sent to rescue it. The plan's strength was its scale. Its weakness was its timetable. Every Japanese force had to arrive in the correct order. Midway had to be attacked first. The American carriers had to react afterward. Submarines had to detect them leaving Hawaii. Nagumo had to prepare the killing ground before the Americans entered it. One early departure could break the sequence. One missed sighting could leave Nagumo blind. And somewhere beneath the headquarters building at Pearl Harbor, a group of exhausted codebreakers was already pulling that timetable apart. The clues did not arrive as a clean translation. They came as fragments, call signs, transmission patterns, repeated code groups, ship movements, and pieces of Japanese messages that were still partly unreadable. In May 1942, the men of Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor were not looking at Japan's full plan. They were assembling its shadow. Commander Joseph Rochefort directed the unit. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton carried its conclusions upstairs to Admiral Chester Nimitz. Together, they were trying to answer one question before Japanese carriers disappeared into the Pacific. What was AF? The letters appeared repeatedly in intercepted Japanese naval traffic. Something large was being prepared against it. Some officers in Washington considered Samoa, Hawaii, or even the American West Coast possible targets. Rochefort and Layton believed AF meant Midway. Belief was not enough. Nimitz had only a few operational carriers left. Lexington had been sunk in the Coral Sea. Yorktown had returned damaged. Enterprise and Hornet were the core of what remained. If Nimitz sent them toward Midway and AF meant somewhere else, he would expose the Central Pacific while sending his most valuable ships toward an empty ocean. If the estimate failed, the Pacific Fleet might lose the ability to stop Japan's next move at all. Inside HiPo, analysts worked through stacks of intercepted traffic, tracking which Japanese units were preparing to sail and how their radio patterns changed. They could often identify that something was moving before they could read exactly what the message said. It was like watching footprints through a locked door, direction without a full view of the man making them. But footprints could still be planted. Japanese communications might contain deception. The Americans needed evidence that Tokyo itself connected AF with Midway. Veteran analyst Jasper Holmes proposed a test. Midway would transmit an uncoded radio message claiming that its water system had failed. The message was deliberately ordinary. No phantom carrier, no invented invasion force, just a remote island reporting that it was running short of fresh water. Nimitz approved the gamble. Japanese listening stations intercepted the transmission. The information moved through their own intelligence system, where it was encoded and sent onward. Then American and Allied stations caught the Japanese traffic coming back. On May 22, the Fleet Radio Unit in Melbourne produced the confirmation Rochefort needed. A Japanese intelligence message reported that AF had only enough water for about 2 weeks and requested immediate resupply. 2 letters had acquired a location. Japan thought the code group concealed Midway. Instead, it exposed the island. AF was Midway. The false message did not reveal every part of Yamamoto's operation. American cryptanalysts still lacked complete access to JN-25. They did not possess a neat folder containing the Japanese battle plan. Even the expected number of carriers, approach routes, and attack date had to be reconstructed from partial decrypts and traffic analysis. But Leighton could now give Nimitz something a commander could use: a likely target, an approximate timetable, and an estimate of where the Japanese carrier force would approach. The detail mattered because intelligence has no battlefield value until somebody moves steel because of it. Nimitz began reinforcing Midway with aircraft, submarines, anti-aircraft guns, fuel, and additional personnel. More importantly, he ordered Enterprise and Hornet back toward Pearl Harbor and prepared to send them west before the Japanese attack began. That decision inverted Yamamoto's entire sequence. Japan expected its first bombs to trigger the American movement. The water message allowed Nimitz to begin that movement days earlier. The codebreakers had not destroyed a ship. They had not fired a gun. They had stolen the one thing every ambush requires: surprise. The intelligence estimate gave Nimitz a destination. It did not give him enough ships. On May 26, Task Force 16 entered Pearl Harbor with Enterprise and Hornet. Their aircraft needed maintenance. Their crews needed rest. Instead, fuel, bombs, spare parts, and new orders began moving aboard almost immediately. The following day, Yorktown appeared off Oahu. She looked like a ship that had survived something she should not have survived. On May 8th, during the Battle of the Coral Sea, a Japanese bomb had punched through Yorktown's flight deck and exploded deep inside the carrier. The blast damaged compartments, opened seams, and sent shock through the ship's structure. Early estimates suggested that a proper overhaul could take about 3 months. Nimitz did not have 3 months. Japanese carriers were already moving toward Midway. Enterprise and Hornet alone would face 4 veteran enemy carriers. Yorktown's damaged steel represented aircraft, scouts, fighters, and 1 additional flight deck that could make the difference between an ambush and a sacrifice. Nimitz ordered the Navy Yard to return her to fighting condition in 3 days. Yard workers and sailors swarmed over the carrier. Welders cut into damaged plating. Electricians traced broken circuits. Pipe fitters worked around ruptured systems. Pumps, cables, tools, and temporary steel patches filled the dry dock while teams worked through the night under floodlights. They were not rebuilding Yorktown. They were buying her one more battle. If a temporary repair failed at sea, flooding or machinery damage could leave the carrier unable to launch aircraft or unable to return to Pearl Harbor at all. On May 29, Yorktown sat in dry dock number 1. In the background stood the wrecked battleship West Virginia, still being salvaged from Pearl Harbor. One ship represented the blow Japan had already delivered. The other was being forced back into the war before Japan expected to see her again. Yorktown left Pearl Harbor on May 30. The repairs were incomplete. Shipyard workers were still aboard finishing tasks as the carrier passed through the channel. Her air group had been rebuilt with replacement aircraft and personnel. She was not restored to peacetime standards. She was operational enough to launch, recover, and fight. That was all Nimitz needed. Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, had sailed 2 days earlier with Enterprise and Hornet. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher followed aboard Yorktown as commander of Task Force 17 and the senior tactical commander of the carrier forces. Their orders were governed by a phrase Nimitz understood better than most commanders: calculated risk. The carriers were too valuable to waste against battleships or secondary targets, but protecting them completely would mean surrendering Midway. Fletcher and Spruance were to defend the island while avoiding exposure to superior Japanese forces they could not damage in return. On June 2, the two task forces rendezvoused roughly 350 miles northeast of Midway. The position was known as Point Luck. From there, the three carriers waited beyond the island's horizon. Midway's patrol aircraft would search the western approaches. The carriers would remain to the northeast, close enough to launch when the Japanese were found, but far enough away to avoid being seen too early. The geography created a blade hidden beside the bait. Yamamoto's submarines were supposed to form a scouting line between Hawaii and Midway and report the American carriers as they moved west. But Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown had passed through before that barrier could warn Nagumo. The Japanese plan was still waiting for the American fleet to leave Pearl Harbor. By June 2, it was already at Point Luck. 3 flight decks sat on an empty ocean. One had been repaired in 72 hours. All 3 now depended on the same thing: finding Nagumo before Nagumo found them. Now picture the morning from Nagumo's bridge. Before dawn on June 4, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood aboard Akagi, with 4 carriers moving southeast through the Pacific. Midway lay ahead. The American carriers were supposed to be at Pearl Harbor, or only beginning to move west. That assumption made the first decision simple. At about 4:30 a.m., the Japanese carriers turned into the wind and launched roughly 108 aircraft against Midway. Bombers carried land attack ordnance. Fighters climbed above them. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the formation toward the atoll, while scout planes spread outward across the surrounding ocean. Nagumo kept a reserve aboard his carriers. Those aircraft were intended for any American warships discovered after the island had been struck. The system looked balanced: 1 strike for Midway, 1 held for the fleet. But a carrier was not a battleship turret waiting to fire. Aircraft had to be armed, fueled, positioned on deck, launched, recovered, and prepared again. The same flight deck could not perform every task at once. When the first strike returned, Nagumo would need clear decks to recover more than 100 aircraft. Every new order consumed time. At 5:45, an American PBY reported many planes approaching Midway from the northwest, about 150 miles away. Minutes later, another report identified Japanese carriers. Midway emptied its runways. Marine fighters climbed to intercept. B-17S, B-26S, Navy torpedo aircraft, Marine bombers, and patrol planes took off to search for Nagumo. By the time Japanese bombs began falling around 6:30, most aircraft capable of leaving the island were already airborne. The strike hit hangars, power systems, fuel facilities, and defensive positions. Smoke rose over Sand Island and Eastern Island. Marine fighters suffered heavily against veteran Zero pilots. From the Japanese cockpit, the attack looked punishing. It was not complete. The runways remained usable. Anti-aircraft guns were still firing. Aircraft from Midway were still coming toward the carriers. Tomonaga transmitted the coded warning Nagumo expected but did not want. The island required another strike. At about 7, the message reached Akagi. No American ships had been confirmed. Nagumo began preparing the reserve aircraft to attack Midway. This was not foolishness. His mission required him to neutralize the airfield before the invasion force approached. A functioning base behind him could keep launching bombers and scouts against his carriers. But the decision started a clock. Ordnance crews began changing weapons. Aircraft prepared with torpedoes for ships needed bombs for the island. Fuel hoses, bomb carts, torpedoes, Tools and aircraft competed for space while the first wave was still returning. Then Midway struck back. At about 7:05, 6 TBF Avengers and 4 Army B-26 Marauders attacked at low altitude with torpedoes. Japanese fighters tore into them. Anti-aircraft fire surrounded the carriers. Most were destroyed or damaged, and no torpedoes struck. To Nagumo, this seemed to confirm Japanese superiority. American aircraft were arriving in small groups, without coordination, and being slaughtered. Then, at approximately 7:28, a delayed scout report arrived from the cruiser tone. Enemy ships sighted. The report did not identify a carrier or describe the formation clearly. Nagumo now faced 2 threats demanding opposite weapons. Midway still required another attack. Unknown ships had appeared to the east. He stopped the rearming and demanded more information. At about 8:20, the answer arrived. The enemy force appeared to include a carrier. By then, the morning had changed shape. Nagumo still possessed 4 carriers. His fighters were winning. The attacks from Midway had caused little direct damage. From his bridge, the Japanese system still looked stronger, but strength was no longer the problem. Time was. The Midway strike needed to land. Combat air patrol fighters needed fuel and ammunition. Reserve aircraft had been caught between 2 missions. Repeated attacks forced the carriers into evasive turns. And beyond the eastern horizon, Enterprise and Hornet had already launched. Yorktown was preparing to follow. Nagumo saw Midway. He saw the failed attacks coming from it. He saw exactly what the American ambush needed him to see. What he could not see were 3 flight decks, sending more than 100 aircraft toward him. The American strike was already coming apart before it found the enemy. Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown had launched more than 100 aircraft across a wide Pacific sky. Their formations separated. Radio discipline limited communication. Fuel began disappearing from gauges while pilots searched an ocean with no landmarks and a target that was still moving. Hornet's air group followed a course that carried most of its dive bombers and fighters north of the Japanese position. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron believed the heading was wrong. Flying lower with 15 obsolete TBD Devastators of Torpedo Squadron 8, he broke away and turned southwest. Waldron found Nagumo. At about 9:20 a.m., VT-8 came in alone. The Devastator was slow, even with a torpedo attached. To release accurately, its pilot had to fly low, straight, and close to the target. Against fast Zero fighters and concentrated anti-aircraft fire, that approach was nearly suicidal. Waldron had warned his men before launch that even if only 1 aircraft remained, it should continue the attack. They did. Japanese fighters dropped onto the formation. Devastators caught fire, broke apart, or struck the water before reaching release range. Waldron was shot down. Aircraft disappeared one after another until Ensign George Gay drove his plane toward a carrier, released his torpedo, and skimmed across the flight deck at roughly mast height. Zeros hit him after the run. His gunner was killed. The Devastator crashed into the sea. None of VT-8's 15 aircraft returned. Of the 30 pilots and aircrewmen who attacked from Hornet, Gay was the only survivor. Wounded and floating among wreckage, he pulled a black seat cushion over himself and watched the Japanese ships maneuver around him. The torpedo missed. From Nagumo's bridge, the attack looked like another American failure. Then more aircraft appeared. At about 10, 14 Devastators from Enterprise's VT-6 arrived without effective fighter protection. They attacked low through the same wall of Zeros and gunfire. 10 were shot down, 4 returned. There was still no torpedo hit. The Japanese carriers continued turning hard to evade. Combat air patrol fighters descended, climbed, landed to refuel, and launched again. Lookouts searched the low horizon because every threat so far had approached just above the water. Then Yorktown's strike reached the area. 12 Devastators of VT-3 came in under Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. This time, fighters accompanied them, including Wildcats led by Lieutenant Commander John Thack, but the escort was too small to control the sky. Zeros tore through the torpedo planes as they began their runs. 10 of the 12 Devastators were lost. Again, no American torpedoes struck a carrier. Between roughly 9:20 and 10:20, 3 carrier torpedo squadrons had attacked. 35 of their 41 Devastators failed to return. Dozens of men were dead or missing. The Mark 13 torpedoes they carried were unreliable, and the surviving weapons achieved nothing visible. No American commander had designed these attacks as a deliberate sacrifice. The squadrons arrived separately because formations had broken apart, headings differed, and communications failed. Their destruction was not the intended mechanism of the ambush, but war does not care whether an advantage was planned. Every attack forced Nagumo's carriers to turn away from the wind or maneuver around torpedoes. Every alarm interrupted deck work. Every group of low-flying devastators pulled Zeros downward and focused Japanese eyes toward the surface. The Americans appeared disorganized because they were disorganized. The Japanese mistook that disorder for safety. Above them, the sky was almost empty. Far to the east, dive bombers from Enterprise were still searching. Their commander, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, had reached the expected position and found nothing but ocean. Fuel needles were falling. Some aircraft had already burned enough gasoline that the return flight was becoming uncertain. If McCluskey turned back, the torpedo squadrons would have died without opening the trap. Then, he saw a single Japanese destroyer below, racing north at high speed and cutting a white wake across the dark water. Its name was Arashi, and it was leading him directly to Nagumo's carriers. The white wake behind Arashi was only a line on the ocean. To Wade McCluskey, it was a direction. The destroyer had broken away from Nagumo's formation to attack the American submarine Nautilus. Now, it was racing north to rejoin the carriers. McCluskey turned his Enterprise dive bombers and followed. His fuel problem had not disappeared. Every extra mile reduced the number of aircraft that might reach home. If Arashi was not returning to the carrier force, McCluskey could lead more than 30 bombers deeper into empty ocean until their engines stopped. Then, the horizon changed. Below him, 4 Japanese carriers moved inside a screen of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Their decks were turning into the wind. Fighters circled low after destroying the torpedo squadrons. Ships carved white curves through the water as they maneuvered around the last attacks. At nearly the same moment, 17 dive bombers from Yorktown arrived from another direction. No one had planned this convergence. At 10:22 a.m., it happened anyway. The American SBD Dauntlesses were above the altitude where Japanese lookouts had been searching. Below, combat air patrol fighters were still low and scattered. Nagumo's carriers had spent nearly an hour evading attacks, recovering aircraft, refueling fighters, and trying to prepare a strike against the newly reported American carrier. The system had survived every individual attack. It had not recovered between them. McCluskey assigned his squadrons to Akagi and Kaga, but in the confusion, most of the Enterprise aircraft began diving on Kaga. Lieutenant Richard Best saw the mistake. If every bomber attacked the same carrier, Akagi the flagship might escape untouched. Best pulled away with the few aircraft still following him and turned toward Akagi. Above Kaga, dive brakes opened. Dauntlesses rolled over and pointed almost vertically at the flight deck. Bombs released at low altitude while pilots pulled against forces that made their vision narrow and their aircraft shudder. Kaga took multiple direct hits. Explosions tore through the flight deck and ignited fires among aircraft, fuel, and ordnance below. Yorktown's bombers struck Soryu. Bombs penetrated the deck and turned the hangar spaces beneath it into a furnace. Best and 2 wingmen came down on Akagi. One bomb struck near the middle elevator and exploded among aircraft in the hangar. The flagship's flight deck was not shattered by dozens of hits. It took one bomb placed where the carrier was most vulnerable. Within roughly 5 minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were mortally damaged. The attacks that had looked wasted helped create a brief, thinly guarded sky above the most dangerous carrier force in the Pacific. But the door had not closed. Hiryu was sailing farther north. Clouds and distance had hidden her from the American dive bombers. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi still had a functioning flight deck, experienced pilots, and the location of at least one American carrier. He attacked immediately. Shortly before noon, Hiryu's first strike found Yorktown. Japanese dive bombers broke through the fighter screen and planted 3 bombs into the carrier. One smashed through the flight deck. Fires spread. Boilers lost power. Yorktown slowed and stopped. For a moment, the carrier appeared finished. Then her crew reversed the damage. Fire parties dragged hoses through smoke. Engineers restored power. Men patched the flight deck, corrected the list, and brought the ship back to speed. Within about an hour, Yorktown was moving again and able to conduct limited flight operations. That recovery created one of the strangest misreadings of the battle. When Hiryu's second strike arrived in the afternoon, its pilots saw a carrier steaming with an intact formation around it. They believed they had found a different American ship. It was Yorktown again. Japanese torpedo bombers came in low from both sides. Fighters and anti-aircraft guns destroyed several, but others reached release range. 2 torpedoes slammed into Yorktown's port side at about 2:45 p.m. The carrier rolled into a severe list. Power failed again. Water moved through damaged compartments faster than pumps could control it. If Yorktown capsized with hundreds of men trapped below, the ship rebuilt in 72 hours would become their steel coffin. Captain Elliot Buckmaster gave the order to abandon ship. Sailors climbed down nets and ropes into destroyers circling beside the listing carrier. Wounded men were lowered in stretchers. The same flight deck Japan believed it had destroyed at Coral Sea now lay silent for the second time that day. Nagumo's 3 carriers were burning, but Hiryu had struck back hard enough to prove the battle was not over. Somewhere beyond the smoke, the 4th Japanese carrier was still moving, and the Americans had only a few hours of daylight left to find her. Hiryu had escaped the morning attack because she was operating north of the other carriers. That distance gave Tamon Yamaguchi enough time to strike Yorktown twice. It did not give him enough time to disappear. American scout aircraft found Hiryu in the afternoon. If they lost her before sunset, the 4th carrier could strike again the next morning. Enterprise launched a final group of Dauntless dive bombers, reinforced by aircraft that had originally belonged to Yorktown. They reached the Japanese carrier shortly before sunset on June 4. Hiryu turned hard beneath them. Fighters climbed. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire. The bombers came down anyway. Several bombs struck the flight deck and forward elevator area, setting aircraft and fuel ablaze. Fires spread beyond control. During the night, Japanese destroyers removed survivors. Yamaguchi chose to remain aboard with Captain Tomeo Kaku. Before dawn on June 5, Japanese torpedoes were fired into the burning carrier to prevent capture. The 4th flight deck was gone. Yorktown was still floating. Salvage teams returned, restarted pumps, and tried to save the carrier that had already survived Coral Sea and 2 Japanese strikes at Midway. On June 6, the submarine I-168 penetrated the American screen and fired torpedoes. One struck the destroyer Hammond, breaking her apart beside Yorktown. 2 more hit the carrier. Yorktown finally rolled over and sank on June 7. The Americans had lost a carrier, a destroyer, roughly 150 aircraft, and 307 men. Japan had lost Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, hundreds of aircraft, and more than 3,000 personnel. Many Japanese aviators survived, but the 4 flight decks, shipboard maintenance teams, command staffs, and carrier organizations that allowed those air groups to strike together were gone. Midway did not win the Pacific War in a single morning. Japan still possessed powerful carriers, skilled aviators, and the ability to inflict catastrophic losses. But the invasion of Midway was abandoned. The carrier force that had attacked Pearl Harbor could no longer operate in the same concentrated form. 2 months later, American forces landed on Guadalcanal, beginning a longer campaign of attrition Japan had hoped to avoid. Yamamoto had designed Midway because he understood the danger of time. American factories would build ships faster than Japan could replace them. He needed to destroy the surviving American carriers before that industrial tide arrived. Instead, his operation destroyed the weapon he needed to hold that tide back. In a Japanese plotting room, 4 carrier names that had once formed the center of the Pacific offensive could now be crossed from the map. Japan sailed to Midway, searching for the American fleet. It never understood that the American fleet had already found Japan. Subscribe for more hidden turning points where intelligence, timing, and one false assumption changed the fate of a war.